everything's fine on 93.9 Dublin South FM.
Thank you. United Nations was not created to bring us heaven, but it was to save us from hell. With great disappointment, I have to say, we find ourselves slipping into the world of really unchecked power, rising authoritarianism, and overall institutional decay. The United Nations has tied us all with an outdated structure and is being held hostage by the very nations, by the very countries that was meant to regulate it. And therefore, I must say, it is not equipped to meet the demands, the new world, the modern world of 21st century. When the Charter of the United Nations was signed in 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II, at the time it was hailed as a moral and institutional thought leadership. President Harry Truman declared that the true power of this charter lay just not in the text, but in the moral fiber of the governments, and that would uphold it. Now today, some 80 years on, that moral fiber is shredded, seems to be not existing, and rather the evidence says no one cares. The United Nations, conceived to promote peace, justice, and humanity, now serves as the stage of geopolitical theater. That's what we can derive from the Security Council meetings. And there are great evidences that the countries are pushing forward their self-interest for a pathetic reason, hypocrisy. And these are the council members who were supposed to enforce the ideals of the United Nations. People were troubled after the post-World War. The emotions were high, and hence there was a great sense of optimism post-World War, and there was a determination to never allow such thing again, to never allow the devastation of the two great wars affect the humanity again. And this gave actually the rise to multilateralism and a consensus to build around peace and human rights and international cooperation. It did made a lot of progress on the fronts where there was a general consensus, like eradication of smallpox or the Montreal Protocol to reverse the ozone depletion, the reduction of global child mortality, advancement of human rights. But then, on the other hand, we don't have a Secretary General who is a woman. So the equality is not starting at home. And to continue counting the achievements during the Cold War, the cooperation on the global health and the development showed that the United Nations could be more than a debating club. So there are achievements at the global level, and these achievements have been making effect to the general population, but they are now becoming a past. Today, the Security Council has become a platform of world's greatest powers to assert dominance or to block action that doesn't suit their agenda. The biggest weapon to dismantle the very concept of Security Council at United Nations is the veto power. At the heart of this United Nations dysfunction lies the Security Council, whose 5 permanent members like the US, the UK, Russia, China and France, they have a disproportionate power through their veto rights. And this mechanism, which was originally designed to prevent another world war, in order to bring about unanimous decision-making consensus, it has now instead paralyzed the global governance for peace. So as of June 2025, the Security Council has passed, if you total up, 2,783 resolutions. And out of those, nearly 300 times, a single permanent member has vetoed a resolution. And this is many a times not to protect global peace, but to shield its own geopolitical interest or its ally. And this abuse of veto power has crippled the Council's effectiveness. The highest number, Russia, for example, has used veto for more than 129 times, including to block actions on Syria and to shield itself from accountability of invading Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. Now there are disputes about what belongs to whom, but then the result is a war. China, while less active historically, has also employed this concept of veto, and this is to stall human rights inquiries and peacekeeping actions. United States more than 50 times just to shield Israel from the scrutiny. And that's including a 2011 resolution which it vetoed. And this resolution was to condemn Israeli settlement in the West Bank, and 2018 resolution condemning Israel's use of force in Gaza, and most recently multiple ceasefire calls between 2023 and 25 to stop escalation of the Gaza conflict. As a result, these vetoes have isolated the United States diplomatically and the other member states who were enabling this impunity, let's say this. So France and the UK, though they are less frequent users in this veto power gameplay, but they are complicit in maintaining a structure that sustains their privileged status. And how can we forget the June 2025 resolution which US vetoed, and that was simply to stop an unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. If the war doesn't stop, how can peace be restored? And how can US veto that? So there is a growing pattern of playing some kind of arsonist by the United States. They were the architect, but now it's about anarchy. It's about not following the rules. So there are funding cuts, especially under the Trump administration, which has affected agencies like World Health Organization or UNRWA. Or earlier, there have been legal evasions bypassing the Security Council to invade Iraq in 2003. And that had set dangerous precedents, undermining international law and accountability. What they did in 2003 is under question every time any other country invades a country or makes military ambitions. So American leadership, by its position, has grown erratic, and it is swinging between an overreach or isolationism. And this is also leaving its allies like European Union or Great Britain confused. On the other side, it has emboldened the adversaries like Russia and China. Russia, on the other hand, has made veto, the obstruction of a resolution, its strategic art. It has repeatedly blocked action on Syria's chemical weapon use, and in the process has propped up an authoritarian regime. Ultimately, the Syrians have gotten rid of Assad, but then the price of his brutal regime had costed millions of lives. Russia's action in Ukraine represents perhaps the most gregarious violation of United Nations Charter in modern times. I wouldn't say most, because United Nations and Israel are in competition, but together the Security Council has been rendered meaningless, helpless to act on its own charter. Consequently, Russia has now started to leverage the anti-UN or anti-America sentiments to influence Africa and elsewhere, and it is portraying itself as an anti-Western alternative. So there are moves into Mali's establishment, and by deploying mercenaries under the guise of peacemaking, and its contribution towards world and international peace is questionable. China cares least for the United Nations. It uses its position with a strategic ambiguity, and it has repurposed itself to only reflect Chinese authoritarian governance model and its strategic interest across the globe. So, for example, it has diluted human rights language in the international treaties, that is to shield itself from scrutiny over Hong Kong human rights violations and Uyghur atrocities. It has created its own power, unchallenged power, in the South China Sea. On and off, it comes in news with its threat to Philippines or Taiwan. So overall, if you see, these actors who were the legitimate pillars of the UN Charter are the states who are eroding the spirit of international peace. Issues like Palestine, nuclear proliferation, humanitarian interventions, these are failing either due to double standards or because of the ambiguity in the United Nations. So if you see a brief modern history of United Nations, despite the troubles at the Security Council, the adoption of the historic pandemic agreement by World Health Assembly in 2024, or the resolution on crime against humanity, and the Pact for Future signed in 2023, they illustrate that there is a need, there is a wish for multilateral cooperation. And on a deeper observation, you see that this coalition is about multi-power, is about middle power nations or a broader General Assembly who have broken this gridlock of the 5 veto power nations and have gone through these historic agreements. So this brings me to the point that there needs to be a structural reform of United Nations if we have to bring peace and prosperity at the global level. This reform should go beyond these 5 countries. Their days are over. The Security Council has to be reconstituted. And the Charter, the UN Charter, the UN Secretariat needs to reclaim its role in crisis mediation. It has to unlock from the wishes, the power of the member states of the Security Council. We need a more independent Secretary General who is just not a symbol, but is also a person whose verdict, whose opinion is sought, whose leadership will mean something for the United Nations and for the global peace at large. So is United Nations fit for 21st century? The answer is no. We need a radical rethinking of its power dynamics and purpose. And today, when we are on the verge of Third World War, the need for a mediation, a need for a neutral, collaborative effort of all the nations is the need of the hour. And if you put a blanket cover on governance of United Nations, it is the moral fabric that we spoke about at the beginning. The moral fabric has to be strengthened. The outlook towards the crisis management, towards the ambition of the veto-wielding power of these nations have to be reassessed, and the United Nations Security Council should not be just left to be a theater of arguments and discussions. It has to be a place for a positive action. With that hope, I leave you until next week. Stay safe, stay informed, and dutifully ask questions. Bye for now.
Everything's fine on 93.9 Dublin South FM.